Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. Last week was a very exciting week in Canberra because we had the federal budget. And for those of us who live in the bubble, that's one of the highlights of the year. And I went into the 6-hour media lockup to have the full immersive experience. I have to say there's not been a lot of reporting about the defence side of that, probably because the integrated investment plan was released about a fortnight ago and that attracted quite a bit of attention. And what occurred in the budget was not so much a doubling up of that, but a bit more detail about the numbers and the timetable. So I would say if anyone is interested in my budget analysis, it's online. You're welcome to have a look at that. So I'm not going to spend this episode going through every line of it. I'll just concentrate on a few of the highlights. In the budget papers, we got a little bit more fidelity, finally, on the funding for the AUKUS nuclear-powered submarine venture. For next year's budget, the numbers are actually in two separate parts of the papers. I don't understand the logic of that, but, this is the way that defence often structures things. And that comes to a total of $13.6 billion over the next 4 years. The operational budget of the Australian Submarine Authority totals $8 billion, and I very much suspect that the bulk of that will be given away to US and UK submarine building companies. I've spoken about this often. And I continue to express my absolute astonishment that this is being done without explanation or accountability. I noticed that many journalists pressed the Prime Minister for answers about 6 soldiers being tested positive for drugs, which of course is a serious issue. But at the same time, most of my colleagues are seemingly totally indifferent to billions of dollars being transferred to companies overseas. I guess this is the world that we live in. But before we completely leave submarines for today, Defence Industry Minister Pat Conroy is fond of repeating that the government will spend $7 billion expanding HMAS Sterling in Western Australia for the rotational deployment, aka a permanent force, of nuclear-powered submarines from the US and the UK from 2027. That's a lot of money, and I looked hard for it in the budget papers for the $7 billion figure. Do you think I could find it? No, I could not. I asked defence officials when I had the chance to speak with them where it was, and what a surprise. They couldn't find it either. Do you think the minister might have simply invented it for political advantage? Surely not. Anyway, I look forward to the next media conference when I can ask him where the $7 billion comes from. Another thing about going through the budget papers is that they highlight the ADF recruitment disaster. I went back and looked at ADF numbers for 2017. That's available just in the budget papers for that year. It's all public. I chose 2017 because it's just after the 2016 white paper that supposedly set the trajectory to increase ADF numbers by 20,000 by the year 2040. Now, I compared that with the current numbers in the ADF, and the ADF has actually shrunk by a bit more than 600 personnel. So with this record, shrinking ADF over the past 7 years, despite the tens of millions, possibly hundreds of millions that have been spent on recruiting, advertising and retention bonuses and all sorts of other things, do you think that this 2040 target can possibly be met? Where are the extra 20,000 people going to come from? Obviously, something needs to fundamentally change. It's not just a matter of money, though that obviously helps, and I note the ADF is currently in the middle of a 3-year period of an 11.8% across-the-board wage increase. And by the way, to that, we need to add 15% superannuation and various generous tax breaks while on operations. So that's not doing it for people. And in my view, a large number of changes need to take place, including better housing, especially when people are deployed on exercises, and improvements to the posting cycle, which, despite people being aware of this for decades, is still family unfriendly, particularly if you've got young kids. But also, in my opinion, the senior leadership culture needs to change. It has turned the ADF into a nasty, secretive, inward-looking organisation with its own sense of entitlement and infallibility. In this day and age, that's a culture that repels a lot of bright young people. Now, another little gem, not quite the right word, contained in the finer detail of the budget papers was that Air 555, that's the Peregrine EW aircraft, 5 of them, based on a Gulfstream airframe, packed with a whole lot of very sensitive electronics, is running 2 years late. There's never been any sort of public acknowledgement of this, but it's there in the detail. But one of the things that I want to highlight is something that was not there. You know, the Sherlock Holmes story about the dog that didn't bark. Well, in this case, the dog that didn't bark is C-3000, the General Purpose Frigate project, which I have christened I haven't christened it the Goat Rodeo. Someone obviously much more perceptive than me labelled it that. I just continue to use it with that acknowledgement to whoever it was who came up with the phrase. Now, the release of the request for information or some sort of Australian industry, the expression of interest or whatever it was meant to go out to the designers, the prime contractors, on Friday of last week. Not a sign of it, which again contradicts the rhetoric of extreme urgency. Now, having said that, I'm actually glad it didn't go out, because these ridiculously rushed procurements don't have a history of going well. One of the reasons why the OPV program is being so heavily criticised by Navy, when it was Navy themselves that made many of the crucial decisions, it's because the government of the day insisted that steel for the first ship be cut in 2018. And I'll have a lot more to say about that in a future podcast. Anyway, that rush deadline caused a lot of problems. Even C-5000, the Hunter-class frigate program, had a whiff of, wow, have we got a deal for you, from defence bureaucrats to the government of the day. And again, there's much more that I'm going to say about that. Oh, by the way, there's a curious dip in Hunter-class funding next financial year, from about the current year 780 million to, from memory, 740 million. I'm not sure why, since the production contract is meant to be signed during that period, and that usually immediately triggers a very large spend. But I'll do my best to find out, and I'll report back to you. Anyway, back to the Goat Rodeo. The General Purpose Frigate. Because senior RAN figures not directly involved in the procurement continue to insist that they will take the ship as is from whoever is chosen. This minimum viability concept. Let's think about that for a moment. I expect that the ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems baseline ship is the MECO 200 for Egypt. That's their most recent contract. The Navantia Alpha 3000 might be based on an Algerian design. I'm not sure about that. The Daegu and Chungnam designs are for the Korean Navy, and the Megami is for the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces. Quick question. Do any of those navies use the English language for all of their signage and displays? Anyone have an answer? Well, they do not. The first two use Arabic, the next two use Korean, and the final one uses Japanese. Now, is anyone seriously expecting that thousands of Australian sailors are going to be retrained in Arabic, Korean, or Japanese? This is the position that the idea of this minimum viable capability is being used to support, which is utterly absurd. This notion that we'll just take whatever is coming off the production lines of those countries. And this, by the way, of language signage, that's before we get to the much more consequential issues of weapons, sensors, and combat systems. The only thing that makes sense is for an Australianised design, with changes being limited to essential things, starting off with English language signage and then weapons, sensors, and combat systems. This has actually been well managed previously in Australia, such as for the Anzac Frigate project, but that requires a customer, in the form of the RAN, to act with a degree of maturity that seems to be a thing of the distant past. As I mentioned previously, the principle is actually quite simple. Agree with the prime contractor about what needs to be delivered and then get out of the way. Other than standard reviews that are necessary to monitor progress and approve payments, just stay out of it. Now, I'm going to use this opportunity to go back into a bit of history to reflect on the RAN culture and the Anzac Frigate project. It's one of my favourite stories. And by the way, none of this is personal. I keep on emphasizing that. I know many people in the ADF, the vast majority of them are perfectly normal, rational human beings, and the self-aware ones accept that there are a lot of problems in the system, but they argue that the system is just too big and too inflexible, and no matter what they might think, they can't change anything. Anyway, I worked for the designer Blom and Voss. We're talking about 1989. The contract had been awarded. We had discussions of Navy. Our offer was based on a MECO frigate for the Portuguese Navy. Now, when you have a close look at the Portuguese frigate, it has a few differences from the ship, the Anzac frigate that Australia ordered. And one of the most consequential is in the powertrain of the ship. The Portuguese frigate has two big LM2500 gas turbine engines supported by two very large MTU diesels. When we got into discussions with the Royal Australian Navy, they said, oh, look, this is a Tier 2 ship, and so we're really not sure about this idea of the two big gas turbine engines. Maybe we should just be a bit more modest and have a single gas turbine engine. Well, we came back to the RAN and we explained. We said, yes, we can do that, but if we do, it's going to mean the complete redesign of the back end of the ship. It also has a number of consequential effects, the most expensive being the need for a completely new gearbox. There's only one manufacturer in the world, in Switzerland, who makes these things. They're shockingly expensive. So we've done the numbers, and it's actually cheaper for you to buy two LM2500 gas turbine engines and leave the back of the ship exactly as it is. The Navy went and thought about that and came back to us and said, these are the brightest minds in the RAN. They came back to us and said, well, we've had to think about it. And no, we would actually like a single gas turbine engine. Thank you very much. So the Royal Australian Navy, Defence, the Commonwealth, you, the taxpayer, ended up spending more money for a ship that cannot accelerate as fast, has a lower top speed than it should have, and also there's an increased maintenance burden for the simple reason that everything has to work much harder. It's like being proud of the economics that you have with your little scooter, but then try and tow a caravan with it and see what happens. Anyway, I tell this story to explain why relatively early in my professional career, I was exposed to rigid military thinking and made me realize quite early on in the piece that sometimes completely irrational decisions are taken for no good reason. Getting back to the General Purpose Frigate, weapons and sensors, I'm fortunately open-minded about weapons, but the RAN is not, and is completely wedded to the United States Navy. I would urge them to look at what New Zealand is up to, but of course they won't. And what I mean by that is the Royal New Zealand Navy has removed the Mark 41 vertical launch missile cells from their two Anzacs and moved to canisterized surface-to-air missiles from European supply MBDA. That's also a topic for another day. But regrettably, I just don't see enough flexibility. I just don't see enough willingness to switch from current orthodoxy to even consider what else is available, particularly from European suppliers, rather than just instinctively, reflexively want to get whatever the USN is using. Now, what else has been happening in the defence space? Yes, the conviction of whistleblower David McBride. I don't know to what extent people outside Australia have been following this story. Again, it's a Canberra bubble thing of the whistleblower and being charged and convicted. And I'm instinctively wary about commenting on a court case based on media reporting. You only get an accurate view, in my opinion, if you are sat in the court all day or read the full transcript, and I have done neither. However, readers will know that I'm a believer in openness and transparency. It's a very easy and cost-effective way of ensuring good government. If more decisions and more conduct was open to full media scrutiny, we would not need anywhere near so many inquiries, including very expensive royal commissions. In almost all cases, these things have been necessary, have been triggered, pardon the pun, because of mistakes and cover-ups within government and bureaucracy that should not have occurred in the first place. Anyway, back to Mr. McBride. He exposed evidence of serious misconduct by special forces in Afghanistan. He leaked to the media at Dan Oakes at the ABC. I know Dan, good journalist. And this was partially responsible for the Brereton inquiry that confirmed many of the allegations and recommended that a number of soldiers be charged with serious offences. The sentencing judge pointed out that McBride's original motivation was actually to protect those of Australian soldiers. Mr. McBride appears to be quite a complex character, but the effect was the opposite, namely that when all of this information that he thought would sort of clear Australian soldiers was read by other people, they came to completely the opposite conclusion. Anyway, the judge criticised him heavily for this business of motivation. For me, motivation is not very important. I think it's the information itself that counts. If I'm leaked something, particularly if it's something very serious, I might ask the person why are they doing it, but I'm much more interested in the content, which always needs to be cross-checked and verified. Now, someone might be doing it for petty reasons. They might have been overlooked for promotion and they hate their boss and they're seeking to damage them. But in the bigger picture, I don't think that matters if the information that is being released is really, really in the public interest. Now, the second point I'd like to make about Mr. McBride, who I've never met, is that he pled guilty to the offences, and that normally encourages leniency from the court, but in this case he's had the book thrown at him. And the judge said that his plea came late in the piece, too late in the piece presumably, and I ask, so what? Sometimes it takes people, including me, a while to figure out what they have done wrong and, in fact, accept and own up to their guilt. Now, having said all of that, the overarching problem is nevertheless with Australia's appalling, repressive, anti-democratic secrecy laws that are amongst the worst in the civilised world. And to be fair to judges, their job is to follow the law. Now, I note that Attorney General Mark Dreyfus has made some improvements, but there's a very, very long way to go. And the ALP government has only about a year to run. Speaking of legislation, some appalling legislation has come into play called Securing Australia's Military Secrets, which will have a chilling effect on all ex-defence employees and will make joining defence even less attractive than it already is. I don't have enough time to do that in this episode, but I will in the next one. Thank you again for listening, and see you next time. Bye for now.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.